But what is mysticism?
It's a word that does require clarification. Typically, mystic, it actually comes from the Greek word mu, mu, meaning silent or mute, meaning ineffable, the contemplation of the one from a place beyond form, beyond concept. And, there's a mystical version of every religion. We've been talking about exoteric and esoteric. Exoteric just means institution, community, and typically mediator, to your point.
Yeah, right.
Whereas the esoterics, there's no mediator between you and the divine. Rumi says, I looked for the divine in churches, temples, and mosques, and I found it in my heart. That's the mystical experience.
Yeah. Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. If you are on the path of, what word don't I hate here? Wonder-dipped seeking, let's say, or just seeking genuine spiritual principles, philosophies, practices, and ideas in general, then you, like me, are well acquainted with a sense of unquenched spiritual longing. You just want the truth. You just want something genuine that you can pour that longing into. But that's not how spirituality works. This is nebulous, subjective territory. And as a result, you're left to just gestate that feeling, and you never really give birth to it, unless that's what happens when we leave this mortal coil. I guess we'll just have to wait and see. And that sounds really defeatist. So here's a couple of things I do know, or do think I know. One, though we can never reach absolute truth, we can continuously get closer and maybe even have direct flashes of that truth through mystical experiences and initiatory experiences. And two, you just can't rush it. And I'm not saying take a passive stance. Yes, educate yourself. Yes, read all the things. Try the different rituals. Look into all different spiritual disciplines. Try different molecules to see what resonates with you. But at the end of the day, you can't rush that second birth, as it's been called. As one of our very favorite wonder saints on this channel, Carl Jung, said, hurry is not of the devil. Hurry is the devil. And honestly, in a way, I find that to be a huge relief. This idea that there is no rush, that as long as we stay somewhat focused and use our discernment and go where it feels genuine to go, we're doing exactly what we need to do. A path will appear. And that really is an idea that runs through this mind meld with my friend and author, Bob Peck, because we talk a lot about mysticism, the esoteric, hidden wisdom, the unified non-dual truth that runs underneath all spiritual traditions. And as far as I can tell, that kind of truth does not rush. In fact, if we were given the truth, we were given the punchline to the cosmic joke, it probably wouldn't make sense to us anyway if we weren't ready. On that note, as mentioned in this one, we've got my friend, author Bob Peck, who wrote a lovely book that hovers around all of these topics and more. It is called Original Sin is a Lie. It is out now. Links to that and all things for Bob are in the description. Do please tickle that algorithm presently with a like, a sub, a comment, a share. It is all of the utmost importance for this media vessel. And did you know we've got over 300 audio-only podcasts going back a number of years that you're never going to be able to hear here on YouTube. So do subscribe to Third Eye Drops on Apple Pods, Spotify, and illuminate those 5 stars while you are in those dimensions. And if you want to go a layer deeper, if that psycho-spiritual longing must be balmed presently, join us over at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. It's also the best and most direct way to support this media vessel, but you will also get access to a community, a patron-only Discord server, patron-only Wonder Gym hangs, which we just had yesterday, and it was absolutely fantastic. We've also got a patron-only book club. You get physical rewards depending on your pledge level and more at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. And with that, my friends, let's meld minds with Bob Peck. This one has been a time in the making. I knew eventually you would be in the mind meld. And though I throw brother around loosely, all the time. I feel like, in the most important sense, you are one, because you seem to be motivated by the exact same existential wriggle as I am. And that wriggle kind of manifests in different ways for everybody, I think. But that's what I sense when I talk to you and I listen to you and I read your book, is this underlying sacred urge. And to be honest, I don't understand how that doesn't consume everyone's life, but
Right.
but I'm always happy when I find someone whose life it does consume, even if it's a little bit different than how it consumes mine.
Likewise. When I first heard the name of your podcast, I was like, this is the greatest name of a
Oh, thanks,
podcast
dude.
I've ever heard. And that hooked me, honestly. And so this is a couple years ago, and then met James, our mutual
Yeah,
buddy, last year, and have been hanging out with him in Austin. And yeah, just getting to know you guys and get closer to your work. I think mystics, where we overlap is like our appreciation for the academics, the scholarly aspect
right.
of all of this stuff historically, etc., alongside of the mystical experience.
Yeah.
I think there's some scholars that need to eat a mushroom.
Oh yeah, no
And,
question. Yeah.
and there's some, you know, Instagram 5D ascended guys and gals that need to dust up on some textbooks, and this sounds judgy. I'm like opening on this holier
No,
than thou
no.
thing, but the balance is good. And that's what
I'll,
I'm trying to shoot for, yeah.
Same, dude. Same. And despite whether that sounds judgy to anyone or not, I 1,000% agree with you.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
nothing drives me crazier than one or the other. Because what do you have? You have this dry, unlubricated, unflexible, empirical weighing and measuring of words on the academic side.
Yeah.
And then you have this loosey goosey, everything is relative, everything is true. It's all this, it's all
Yeah.
love, it's all light. And I'm sorry, but even if on some ontological level that may be true, right? Like some of the mystics I'm sure we're going to brush on today probably wouldn't say anything too differently,
Too different from those guys and
but you
gals, yeah.
still have to live in relative reality. That
Yeah.
sort of Buddhist, you're probably familiar with that Buddhist two truths doctrine idea, right? Of like, there is perfection, but there's also relativity, and you
Yeah.
live in both worlds, and they're both true at the same time. So it's not the most practical thing to just focus on that love, light, perfection, ascension all the time. And that leads to what, of course, has become known as spiritual bypassing. But
Yeah. and
anyway, man,
and
yeah.
of course, in Miracles talks about level confusion, which is
Mm,
huge. Anytime you're talking about non-duality and the illusion, Ken Wapnick, who's the editor, one of the main early publishers, he said that it really disheartened him because he would hear of A Course in Miracles students going to funerals wearing white and bringing flowers and balloons,
ooh,
and going, it's all an illusion, it's all a dream. People going, that's you're being a dick,
yeah,
actually.
for sure.
You
Right.
still, what this stuff should do is engender compassion, which creates empathy, which create not
Yeah.
dismissive living, and that's from the guy who practically helped put it together, this non-dual masterpiece. So
Yeah, tell me more about A Course in Miracles. And before we go there,
mhm.
that's something that I notice a lot with religion and spirituality in general, is this kind of behavior where it's like, even if it's motivated maybe from a good place, from the outside looking in, I always have this question of, who is this for? Because it seems like what
Mm.
you're doing right now is actually for you. It's not really for,
Right.
like, you're not benefiting anyone at this funeral by doing this. Same with like really, um, fire and brimstone, ire wielding people who stand on street corners with like pictures of obliterated feti. It's like,
Right.
who are you doing this for? Because clearly you're dry. You're not going to bring anyone over to your side with this tactic. Like, you're doing this for you. You're doing this because you're perceiving that this is going to have some kind of good benefit for you down the road. But anyway,
Yeah, or
yeah,
you have some insecurity that you need validated,
right.
essentially that you're acting out of. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So, but yeah, like so for people that don't know, you and I are IRL friends. We text back and forth. We share things all the time. And I've noticed that you talk about A Course in Miracles pretty often. I don't know anything about it. Um,
It's cool.
yeah. Give me the download.
Well, it's very uncompromising is a good word for it. It's a non-dual text. I consider it a spiritual masterpiece. It was published in 1976, and it was intuited, which isn't for everyone. Hi, materialists listening to Michael. It was intuited by a woman named Helen Schuckman. She was an atheist Jewish psychotherapist in New
Hmm.
York City
Interesting.
and Columbia, I believe. And it began from the decision that her and her colleague Bill Thetford had to find a better way or another way to unite with each other, basically, to avoid the endless bureaucracy of their work environment. It was a hospital, it was a research facility, and a university. It was just this kind of bizarro, um, labyrinthine of frustration and kind of Game of Thronesian squabbling every day.
Like
And
jockeying for position and such.
yes, it
Yeah.
was this kind of perfect setting for just ego land. And um, Bill said something like, there has to be a better way to work in this environment. And Helen said, uh, I agree with you and I'll help you find it, right? Somewhat famously. And after that, she started having very powerful dreams, kind of like
Hmm.
shamanic dreams for a few months, which she had never really had. And then she started hearing a voice, not an audible voice, but she's described that process as it being more of intuitive writing. And so anyway, what is it? It's long. It's three parts. It has the text, the workbook, which is 365 daily lessons, and then the manual for teachers. So it has this kind of academic format framework, which is cool. I think it defines itself as a self-study curriculum. But yeah, it's very good, and I think the reason why it's so compelling to me is because there's many lines in it, with some of which I quote in my book, that sound verbatim like Sri Ramana Maharshi
Hmm.
and Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj, the two kind of main Advaita Vedanta masters of the last century, which I know you're aware of, and Zen also. I think Zen Buddhism typically, yeah, there's a secular westernized Zen in the mindfulness world, which is fine. And I do mindfulness work with secular people, even in my corporation job, but kind of deeper Zen, gosh, what's the Dogen Shobojinzo? Um, some Thich Nhat Hanh, even Thich Nhat Hanh wrote Zen Keys, which is
Right.
really hardcore. But anyway, there's some Zen that has a lot of non-dual
Oh yeah, dude. Yeah.
components as well. So anyway, the overlap in the non-dual traditions, I see ACIM, of course, Miracles, Advaita, and Zen as kind of being these really powerful veil breaker
Yeah.
type stuff.
Yeah, this is a whole interesting path. The sort of secularization and de-spiritualization of Buddhism is a sort of that's an interesting fertile topic. I've gone there a lot.
It
Have you ever
is.
listened to any of the mind melds with Miles Neal? He's a psychologist, Tibetan Buddhist. Um,
No, but I'm very close to that conversation,
yeah,
and I could definitely talk about it because I think the first thing is you have to acknowledge the tradition. Like if you strip it entirely from the tradition, it's going to be emptier. It's going to be wooden, and at the same time, I do think that there's nuance to this because even the Dalai Lama said,
Yeah.
if you guys, basically he said, take meditation. He told Richie Davidson this, the co-writer of Altered Traits with Dan Goleman, this, neuroscientist researcher in meditation studies for 40 years. He said, take the religion out of Buddhism so that the Americans will do it. They're
Yeah, right.
actually the masters themselves kind of validated this. And I think some of the critiques of Western secularized Buddhism don't tend to acknowledge that they were okay with it Trojan
Yeah.
horsing.
Yeah, and that's exactly the word that I was thinking. And
Yeah.
I don't want to go too far down this because I want to go back to
Yeah.
the Course in Miracles,
Sure.
but yeah, Trojan horse is one of those ideas because you and I both know if you sit there long enough and you start to peel back the layers on the onion of the mind, or maybe you just go dive straight into the deep end of the pool and you have a psychedelic experience, and that leads to bigger questions about what your mind is, what consciousness is, what psyche is. That is going to lead to philosophical, spiritual questions, and you're going to find it,
Totally.
and the snake's going to eat its tail eventually. But before we go there
Yeah.
and talk about like Mick mindfulness versus like being able to accept the the nucleus of throbbing mysterium tremendum, mysterium fascinosum, or whatever.
I love your
The two
Hellenistic lingo.
the two binaries of the non-dual,
Mm-hmm.
which there's some fun paradox in there. But yeah, it's funny, man, because that moment, you were talking to the hypothetical materialist skeptic, and I have a considerable part of my mind still that, like, when I hear something's channeled, I'm like, I raise an eyebrow.
Yeah.
But at the same
Well, that
time,
percentage of your mind of it that's the percentage of your audience.
yeah, maybe it could be,
Yeah.
and it probably
Uh-huh.
likewise fluctuates on a daily basis.
Right.
But at the same time, if we're honest, I think most people who are open to a spiritual reality secretly want that. Like, they secretly want their
The transcendental.
their daimon, their genius, their higher self, something, something above their mundane mind. They would love to connect to that. They would love to have it be a sort of personal proof of theory that, hey, this really exists and you really can tap in to
Yeah.
this higher, some kind of higher intelligence, whether it's in you or outside of you or whatever it is. So yeah, I share
I
that,
think
but
you're
it's
right.
like there's this weird, there is some sort of like threshold or bar in my mind that needs clearing before I'm willing to know, well, what do you mean it's intuitive? What do you mean it's channeled? Because I think we can look back at things like Jung's Red Book, for instance.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know if he ever used the word channeled, but it's fucking channeled. Like, especially if you read like the Seven Sermons to the Dead portion of it that he originally actually
Yeah.
ascribed to Basilides, the Gnostic father.
teacher. Yeah.
That sounds incredibly channeled. It sounds incredibly Platonic and magical and hermetic and Gnostic. And it's just like, and I know not all three of those things necessarily gel together, but I can explain what I mean later. So that it's like, yes, I'm down with it, and I'm kind of even more down with it because you tried to not ascribe it to yourself and not take credit for it. And actually, a lot of people don't know the Red Book sat collecting dust for like 30 plus years.
Oh, yeah, at least several decades.
Yeah, and it didn't come to no. I actually think it was 30 years till after he died. I think that's what it is. Until it came out. So
he's fascinating because he's so well respected,
right,
in 9 or 10 disciplines, of thought. Not and there's a really great Terry McKenna lecture actually on Jung, which is kind of funny to hear him talk about him, because he's saying that a lot of people really love his early stuff, which is great. Archetypes, collective unconscious, the psyche, the dream, it's very rich, the early years. But he goes, y'all got to check out his later stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Because that's where, he really goes down the rabbit hole. And it's like, he didn't lose his mind. I mean, that famous BBC interview is like, I think
Yeah.
in the last few years of his life, and he's lucid,
Oh yeah.
he's joyful. I mean, it's like he's a great person to point to kind of the legitimizing or a validating of the transcendental for me.
100%. And he's one of those people too who walked that perennial philosophy path and found the wisdom in,
Right,
like toward the end of his life, got very into Eastern mysticism and yoga, and his obsession with mandalas and everything is well known. And he rigorously dove into alchemy, rigorously dove into
right,
like the entire Western canon of philosophy and myth and Grail legends and just all of this stuff. And he was able to wrap it in psyche in a non-reductive way, not in a
mm.
way where he's saying like, oh, everything is just in your mind, more like everything is in the mind,
The
like
mind.
everything is
Yeah.
in the mind at large,
Mm.
like nous capital N type mind. And it all fits together in a disturbingly perfect way. It's just like, I mean, he's one of those people in that, I've talked on the show before about that golden chain of perennial philosophy
Yeah.
thinkers, that if that thing really exists, or if it's just something that we're making up, nominalistically or postmodernly, like, when we're deciding like, yes, this person is a link, he was a link, regardless of which direction we're looking at it from.
Totally. He's
But
massive. And actually what's interesting too is, speaking of course, and stumbling into Jung, um, one of the primary components of A Course in Miracles is actually the distinction between the ego and the Holy Spirit. It's
mm,
not quite the Jungian and not quite the Freudian definitions of the term, but they're close. And Wapnick, again, I'm quoting Ken Wapnick again, the editor, who he basically said that we needed Freud and Jung to then be able to get a course. We had to be able to understand the mind at this level of sophistication before being able to have a document like this, essentially, kind of the zoom out scheme of information on this planet. There's a sequential order to it in some capacity.
yeah. So
So they're
what makes
foundational.
that book series so important and so makes it stick out to you versus um some of the other
Anything
stuff you're
else?
interested, like the more, like the Vedanta teachers you mentioned, Jung,
Yeah.
or whatever. Like, what is it about that book specifically that you
Well, it's very thorough.
mm,
It's not for everybody, too. I mean, to come back to the perennial philosophy briefly, I'm of the viewpoint that all paths are valid, essentially, and that all of these different human psychodynamics have a corresponding path. Um, the truth is many. The truth is one. The sages call it by many names. Rig
right?
Veda. There's this idea within the Indian subcontinent, primarily, that there's a very wide variety of ways to get to the one. So I do say that before I kind of make a commercial for one of my faves. But I think ACIM in general um, does have a level of detail and sophistication necessary for people that, in some ways, and this is with utmost reverence for Sri Ramana Maharshi, but for an example, he didn't say that much.
Mm,
He's his primary teaching was silence,
yeah,
and his secondary teaching was reserved for people who didn't get the first. Is kind of
right.
the joke. It's like, if you don't get that, if you don't just get it while you're sitting in his presence, then he'll say some stuff. And I mean, Be As You Are is like this thick. I mean, it's 35 pages or something like that. There's more, but that's kind of like his core foundational thing. And it's just things that people jotted down that he said frantically. And so I think what that's done nearly a century later is engender some misinterpretation,
Of course, yeah.
primarily, right? And so, and we were talking about, there's that article about Advaita, Neo Advaita, um, by Tim Conway, which is amazing. And I'm going to do more work on that article soon, because it's really, really good in comparing exactly what we're talking about, and comparing the misunderstanding of contemporary spiritual teaching and living with this kind of the real thing, if you will, the authentic, I'd say more heart-centered aspect of even heady stuff like non-duality and jnana
Right.
yoga. You still
Let's
can't get rid of the morality. But so I'd say all this is to say ACIM really gives you an almost overwhelming amount of material to be that precise, which I think is
Interesting.
very advantageous.
Yeah, yeah, that's such a well, there's as usual, there's so many different paths I want to go down here, but that phenomenon in and of itself is really interesting. The teachers who choose to write a lot
Yeah.
or refuse to write anything. And I mean, you see this going back like very I mean, in the Western tradition, Socrates is the
Socrates
most
and Plato. Yeah,
famous example. Like
sure.
Socrates refused to write anything down, didn't want his words to be immortalized in any way, and we only really know of him
Whoops.
yeah, right. And we only really know of him secondhand through primarily Plato, who then used Socrates as a primary character in a lot of his dialogues. And you know, we can't know if any of the quotes that he said were things he legitimately said or they're used to prove philosophical points, though we can, you know, extrapolate from things like Socrates' trial. These are probably things that he actually said and did. But anyway, um but then, you know, you have people like Socrates who don't want to write. Then you have Plato who does write a lot, but all of the writings are like soaked in esoteric meanings and
Yeah.
require esoteric hermeneutics to like really make sense of and get to the bottom of, or even have a foggy idea of what he was saying. And then you get to people even like late Platonists like Plotinus. He didn't want to write anything down, but then you had students of his, primarily Porphyry, who are like, no, we got to write this shit down. We got to immortalize this stuff. And
Yeah.
thank God he did, because now we have the Enneads, which is like one of the primary sources of Platonic wisdom. But this exists, you know, in the East, in the West. And why? So let me throw it this way, because I think this is going to get into some interesting territory. Why do you think a lot of these teachers don't want their writings written down?
It seems like there's a state of being that I do not occupy that has no need to, or that just exists in this powerful level of presence and generative energy. Neem Karoli Baba is another
Mhm.
example. Ram Dass's guru is another example, who wrote down nothing, and they wrote down everything. He wrote "Be Here Now" and all this stuff. Larry Brilliant, who was a former Google uh, co-exec. He was involved with the World Health Organization, helped rid smallpox. He's this crazy guy. He was a bearded devotee of Maharaji.
Mm.
He said, um, it wasn't that Maharaji was loving. It was that when we were sitting near him, I felt loving.
Yeah.
It has this contagious
Yes.
quality to the energy. And so, yeah, I think they kind of live in that, and that creates the students that feel compelled to capture it, share it, talk about it. But yeah, it seems to be a different dynamic.
Yeah. 100%. And that radiation is definitely a I think it's a contagious thing in both directions, obviously. Like if you're around a really just negative, sour person, obviously that's going to get
Sure.
to you. If you're around somebody who's really loving and always thinking about other people, especially someone that you appreciate, that's going to make you want to be more like them. And this happens
Hmm.
on like mundane friend levels too. Like,
Yeah.
though I do think actually, I was going to talk about my friend Colin, but I do think Colin is an incredibly spiritually advanced person who puts other people before him a lot. Colin Frangisetto, for listeners or people who don't know, but he's an artist, close friend of mine, and from the first time we hung out, I was like, oh, this dude's not just talking about ideas. He really is in a state of consciousness where he's thinking about other people, where he's wanting to do things for other people, where he's putting the needs of someone else before him. And that then makes me want to be more like that. And
That's beautiful.
it's a great feeling to be around. And I think we need that. Like we need, especially I think we've always needed it, but in the world we live in now, where it really is all about ego, all about perception, all about, even in spirituality, a lot of these people are like, spirituality is kind of your brand more than it is your actual
Yeah. It's an
personhood
interesting
way of
time.
being. Um,
Yeah.
and if you want to combat that current, that like vapid egoic current, you need other people who like really want to be that way. And then you can magnify that way of being together. And I think that starts to get into why it's so important to have a community, even if it's not a physical community. But I do think that
That's true.
the physical component's very important because you feel it so much more readily.
Yeah, there's a couple of great things you said there. I actually do get a lot of people now reaching out saying, "Okay, I'm deconstructed." That's kind of a term that in the space I'm in, kind of post-Christian spiritual, the 24-year-old that left their church that did
Mm-hmm.
mushrooms and doesn't know. That's kind of who I'm speaking to, I guess. And they say, well, where do we go? Where do we meet up? And it's Michael Phillip, Third Eye, Patreon. No,
Third
I
eye
mean, I'd
drops.
say
Third eye
that in
drops.
jest. I'm sorry. Yeah, Third Eye Drops. I say that in jest, but I also sincerely, you're one of the really great online communities. There's a few of y'all. Frankly, I think there's a handful of like really great spiritual communities online. Try to find some in person. Unity Church is pretty good. Or
Don't you
yoga
dare mention
studios.
any. No, I'm joking. Only
Yoga
this one though.
studios, right? I know. And let me put my referral links in the description. No, but because that's the three jewels of Buddhism: the
Yeah.
Dharma, the Sangha, and the Buddha. The Dharma is
Mm-hmm.
the duty, the responsibility of the seeker.
The
The
teachings.
Sangha
Yeah.
is the community itself, and the Buddha is the teacher. Right. So all three of those are required. So yeah, you're right there. And I will say, I mean, this might be an interesting dive off into some of the conceptual in terms of what you said there about the ego's kind of proliferation right now, as though it's more as, to imply that we live in an even more egotistical time than other times, which might be true. I'm not disagreeing with that, but what A Course says, and what I think really non-dual mystic philosophy in general says, is this plane, this world, is the ego's domain.
Mm-hmm.
This is separation land. And this is where we all think that we're these separate entities and separate identities, which is a false notion. And so the mystic philosophers tell us, and these sages sitting on the top of the Himalayas say, we're just undoing that. That's all. That's all we're doing. We're just trapped in this state of ignorance, this dreamlike delusion of our separateness. That's kind of non-duality 101.
Right.
We can get into greater detail there, but the ego, this is where it is. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? It's not necessarily a matter of more or less. To me, it's a matter of, can we undo it? Can we work on letting it melt away?
Yeah. And I don't think there's a way to fully undo it. Like as long as we're in this realm. But I think, Matt, before we go here, because this is a whole this is going to get into the deep, like
This could
the practical, the metaphysical, the soul,
Gnostic
like
and Platonic.
right, yeah, exactly. Um, but before we go there,
Yeah.
what we were talking about before, like why do some people write things down? Why don't
Mm-hmm.
they? And then furthermore, why aren't they just clear about what they mean? Why do they need to make things esoteric?
Mm.
Why do you need to
Yeah.
have initiations? It leads to all these interesting questions. So I don't want to leave this behind. But like
Sure.
the other thing to consider with writing, what does it do? It solidifies and captures something that in the case of what we're talking about is ultimately uncapturable, is
Right.
ultimately like you can't talk directly about it, so you're going to create all kinds of arguments, you're going to create all kinds of comparisons, and all then downstream it has all these effects of being compared to something else. It probably didn't even exist at the time the person was alive, and then you
Yeah.
start getting in this
And
weird,
then it's 4 languages ago.
right? Yeah,
Too.
right.
I mean, that's a big one in the New Testament.
100%. Yeah. So I think that plays into it. But then it leads into this interesting question of why aren't these instruction manuals, Bob? Like why don't these teachers, why didn't Plato publish his esoteric teachings? Why don't these other teachers just say, do it like this, sit like this, only do this? And then it's going to tell you everything that's going to happen. And then you just keep doing this. And then that'll get you to this point. Why is it necessary to shroud it? Why is it necessary to talk in parables? Why is it necessary to have esoteric teachings? And why don't exoteric teachings work, do you think, to just throw you a million?
Yeah, no, it's great. It's a great question. I love this is the only things that I want to talk about, Michael. You're referencing, I have a chapter in my book about layers of the teaching, specifically referring to Jesus in the New Testament. In my book, Original Sin is a Lie, out now, I cover that in terms of it's not often discussed, frankly, in the church, in terms of the audience that he's speaking to. What level of, to use your terms here, exoteric and esoteric, or literal and direct to the more spiritual and allegorical. I do think church-going Christians are certainly familiar with spiritual allegory from time to time. But I think in my studies, and I have a bachelor's in formative Christianity, concentration in religious studies at UT. I don't have all the letters after my name like many of your guests, but longtime student of Bible scholarship, and essentially Jesus is going around the countryside. He's basically speaking to, kind of to simplify it, about 3 different groups of people. He's either speaking to very large crowds, he's speaking to smaller groups of still strangers, and then he's speaking to the close disciples. And whatever he's saying from a teaching standpoint, if you really want to understand the meaning, that's the first thing you look at. You try to understand what's the environment, in which he is talking about. And to the big crowds is the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the poor, blessed are those who mourn, etc. That's the direct literal teaching. And those are useful ethical teachings. They're for people who don't need any really level of familiarity with him or what he's trying to do. And then when he's talking to the disciples, that's when things really ramp up, because they're living with the master. I mean, I think, to answer your question directly here, you don't teach calculus to kindergartners. When you're studying this stuff and you're familiar with it, you're doing your own inner work for years, living in close proximity to someone like this, in my view, an awakened being, Jesus of Nazareth. The teaching is going to be a little different. And I'll give you a quick example, which is one of my faves. And it also, I'm going to reference our buddy Joe Campbell, who I know you love.
Love Joseph Campbell, yeah, of course.
So there's this line in Matthew, which is, he says, "I come not to bring a sword." I'm sorry, I come to bring a sword. Oh boy, yeah. This is Monday morning. He says, I come not to bring peace, I come to bring a sword, is the line. The line is in Matthew, it's 10:34. "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword," says Jesus. And that's a line that's on the bumper sticker of the veterans F-150. You know what I'm saying? I mean, that's a term that the religious right in America loves, as though it implies this militaristic thing. And it sounds like it on the face of it. If you don't know anything about kind of what we were just talking about, it does sound like that. Do not think that I have come to bring peace. I've not come to bring peace, but a sword. So this particular moment in the New Testament, Jesus is talking to the disciples. That is a moment in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he actually even says this real quick before I explain that. He says in Mark 4:10, when he was alone, those who were around him with the 12 asked him about the parables. He said to them, "To you is given the mystery of God's kingdom, but to those who are outside, all things are done in parables." So don't take it from me. This idea is actually in the Bible. He clarifies this, that he's changing the message based on, and the meaning and the layers of the meaning based on the audience. Okay, do not think that I've come to bring peace to the earth, but a sword. This is to the close disciples in the garden. And Yogananda, who I'm a huge fan of, my book's actually dedicated to Paramahansa Yogananda, this great 20th century yogi from India who actually lived for decades in America, died in Los Angeles. He interpreted Jesus, he interpreted a lot of the Bible. He wrote commentaries on the Gita. He was just very prolific guy, kind of in contrast to those silent gurus. Yogananda was very prolific. Anyway, he wrote this interpretation of "I come not to bring peace but a sword." He says, "Think not that I came to bring material peace for souls to be settled complacently in earthly life.
Yeah.
I came not to offer short-lasting material happiness, but to give to the valiant spiritual soul a two-edged sword of wisdom and self-control, divine strength and determination by which he can sever the compulsions of material passions that might obstruct his attainment of the everlasting happiness and freedom."
Yeah.
The spiritual sword of discipline, right? And I quote that in my book, and I also reference the Joseph Campbell. There's a PBS special, Power of Myth,
Yeah,
which
I
is
love it.
great.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've watched it a million times like me. Bill Moyers asked Joe Campbell about this line, and Campbell mentions the Sanskrit term viveka, which means discrimination. And he mentions Manjushri, who is a very significant bodhisattva. He's always pictured with a flaming sword.
Yeah.
And so Manjushri is wielding the sword of discrimination, to kind of borrow the interpretation of Yogananda's read of Jesus. And so, this stuff really comes alive for me when you're able to take those deeper reads, when you're able to kind of look at other traditions in the kind of the mystic pantheon. So yeah, I love that read from Yogananda.
Yeah, me too. And that's interesting. The sort of discrimination in, by the way, not in a racist way, but like in a way of
discernment.
Right.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
discernment. Yeah.
That's funny.
Because if you think about that also applies to this conversation about esoteric versus exoteric, because you need to know when someone is ready for something as a teacher. And the way you put it, you don't teach calculus to kindergartners, is a nicer way of, there's two legs to this argument that I've usually heard, and that's one of them. A lot of times people will say you don't put pearls before swine. You don't, someone who's not ready,
to quote the Nazarene.
Right, yeah. Someone who's not ready for a teaching, don't give it to them. And why is this? Like, and why does this discrimination apply here? Because once I think, we pass ideas around, even spiritual, deeply held ideas. We pass them around like they're just a fucking tater tot these days, right? Like it's just like, oh yeah, here's, I think this, I believe this, I whatever. But place yourself in the position of someone.
Hey, my story shares have meaning.
Right. Yeah. No, I know. But put yourself in the position of, I've really worked at this with the rigor of a monk, academic, philosopher for years. I've had primary mystical experiences. I've thought very deeply about how best to communicate this idea to someone who's ready for it, when I can see that they're right at the point where this is what they need, versus like just going out there and telling it to as many people as you can with who knows what baggage, who knows what motivations, and then they're going to misappropriate your teachings. Like, that's not what I meant at all. And clearly we see that running amok in all in modern religion. Just even if you identify as a religion or not, look to the person you disagree with who also is calling themselves a Christian or a Muslim or whatever that you disagree with, right? It's coming from these kinds of misunderstandings or unagreed upon teaching. So if you're teaching in a small group and you are initiating people, like, we look back, this was kind of par for the course from my understanding. Like in the ancient Hellenic world and even Roman world, there were these mystery cults. You got initiated one step at a time. You had certain experiences at certain times. You got certain teachings at certain times. So it makes sense that Jesus probably would have been thinking this way as well. Like, this is the culture he's a part of.
Sure.
And then the other interesting, element of it that Jesus is also unfortunately an example of is it's fucking dangerous. Like, some of these things
very dangerous.
are dangerous ideas, and I have to trust you deeply before I communicate this to you, because this could get me hung, this could get me crucified, this could get me burned at the stake, this could whatever. So you don't teach the esoteric teaching until you know this person can be trusted. So this is why
Great point.
It's hard sometimes to get into these secret societies. Like the Pythagoreans, you can't really, I think it's hard to say anything for sure about the Pythagoreans because it's so shrouded in history and lore and stuff like that,
and myth and what's real.
Yeah,
and
right,
not.
right. Like he can levitate. Pythagoras can bilocate. He can basically do all these.
The triangle guy.
Yeah, you didn't know this stuff. Yeah. But supposedly,
there's a lot of great. Oh,
real quick, just supposedly to become a Pythagorean, there was some preposterous vow of silence for like 5 years or 10 years, and then you could get like
That's
the
amazing.
introductory teaching, if that's true. I mean, who knows? But yeah,
the pre-Socratics.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, shout out to Socrates, because there's before and after you, dog. No, there's a lot of validity in what you said from the, because some of it sounds off-putting on the face. Secret society, this kind of elitist, at its worst, right? That's the critique, is that these guys are specialer than everyone. And, I think the disclaimer there too, for me, would be the beauty of the mystic philosophy actually is that it completely equalizes the potentiality of all beings. We are all one. We all have this inherent capacity innately, inherently. Our essence is the same. On the level of form, however, we're working at different levels of consciousness, of understanding, based on our past actions, based on our, intellectual capacity, and a common image is the mirror, polishing the mirror. That's really a beautiful kind of contrast to dirty sinner in, kind of institutional Christianity. You have, we're just polishing the mirror. We're all reflections of the divine, but some mirrors are dirtier than others, and that's really all we're doing. We're just getting to that, again, ego undoing. Paul says, see through a glass darkly. Rumi has this great line too, where he says, if you're irritated by every rub, how will your mirror be polished?
Yeah, right.
That's really the idea. So I do want to say, like, yes, there is a reason, damn good reasons for this material being specialized in some capacity. It's open to every person, ultimately, and every being.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, if you're ready for it, right? If you're ready for it, because depending on what POV you're coming from, I mean, let's look at something that I was going to say both, but I don't know for sure what your relationship with psychedelics is, or if how openly you talk about it. But
positive.
But on the other hand, we've seen, right?
I'm tripping balls right now. Can you not tell?
No, because you're such a pro. But that's one of those things, right? Like, I can't imagine coming out of those experiences not just being absolutely prostrated to the mystery and
Right.
absolutely in awe and absolutely having had my ego and even the ideas that I was approaching the experience with, just being like, I always hit this point in those experiences where I'm just like, you dumb, 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 dummy. You dumb, dumb, dummy. You came back here thinking this again? We got to destroy this all
Yeah.
over again and like strip you naked all over again and like just undress your ego all over again. And then
You
you
find
just
out
come,
that the computer doesn't work quite as
yeah.
well as you thought.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even and that's what those experiences are great for, is like stripping away the things you didn't even like remember that you were holding on to, or that you were like
Hmm.
were stuck to your psyche. Um and sometimes they stick other things to your psyche, I think, too, but we can talk more about that later. But but we've seen somehow some people don't walk away from those experiences feeling that way. Some
Right.
people do use those experiences as another feather in the cap, or as another feather on the plume of the peacock that is their ego. And it's so yeah, yet another example of why it's important to from the vantage point, especially of one of these teachers like we're talking about, choosing who's ready for that, like mysterium tremendum fascinosium experience. Because it's like, you have to know, like, is this person going to walk away from this experience with the teaching, or are they going to
Hmm.
walk away with like needing more teachings before? And by the way, who am
Yeah.
I to say what's what? But this is just
Well,
my
no,
my
I think
thing.
that's
Yeah.
all true. And, the idea kind of in Hindu and like yoga lineages is that the guru can know that they
Yeah.
have this kind of super consciousness that they've accessed that gives them more clarity on, I've read a lot of really New Testament specialty is my specialty in some areas, and then kind of more contemporary Hindu guru stories. Yogananda, the Ramakrishna biography is terrific. Gospel of Ramakrishna, um, all those stories around him and Vivekananda and the disciples, and then the Neem Karoli Baba, the Ram Dass, even more recently, stuff. And basically these guys just they know exactly what little flick of practical whatever for each person, and it's always different depending on the person. It's like they're not, even though there really is real world mechanics to it, it doesn't seem to be this rational mind kind of, well, they're like this, therefore I do this. It seems like they're just in this flow state
Yeah.
of kind of vesselhood of spirit of creator of, they're in this oneness space where they just can know how to support people in that really beautiful way. And one thing maybe that's a nice tie into one thing I wanted to mention to you is kind of, I think in a lot of your work, at least when I hear the scholars come on and which I love, I think it's important to point out that we've talked about this a little bit, but just the rational versus the intuitive, and just harmonizing them, the value of harmonizing them. There's a Ram Dass quote where he says, "We worship at the altar of the rational mind. That's the new religion now in contemporary civilization." And the rational mind's good. It's useful and it's good. It's really good at implementing, but to consider it the sole source of all knowledge, I think, is a misstep. We still want to honor the intuitive. I think psychedelics, to your recent point here, does a good job of
Yeah.
making sure that we zoom out enough to not neglect it. But I think it's a real lament that we're so hyper rationalized these days.
Yeah. And what's so sad is we're so hyper rationalized in that colloquial sense that you're talking about, that we've lost the original meaning of what rational is. Like,
Sure.
rational used to mean intuitive in the way that you're
Harmonized.
talking about, where
Oh,
it's like
wow. That's funny.
you're using, like, so the famous divide is like the supposed, which I think this is kind of not even 100% real, but the classical rational empirical divide was like, you have Plato on the rational side, you have Aristotle on the empirical side. The
Got it.
rational
Oh, and
meaning,
he's
you can
such an intuitive
right,
thinker.
you can
Yeah.
rational meaning, no, you actually discover truth through application of the logos,
Mm.
through touching nous, through waking up the divine mind, the nous, in your own mind, soul. That's where knowledge comes from. And then you have the sort of cartoonish depiction of Aristotle, and like no, you go out in the world and you empirically acquire stuff by
Yeah.
weighing and measuring it. And that way of thinking
Species.
has won out so much that now when we say rational, we think brain power. We think
I'm thinking, I'm using
like
it more in
number
the kind of
crunching.
analytical is
Yeah,
kind of
right.
the way I mean that.
And that's how 99% of
Yeah.
people use that word. And
That's funny.
like it's a bummer that we've lost it. Like the that way of think. But whatever, they're
Yeah.
just words. But what I really think, man, the running truth of all this stuff is, and even amongst these sects that would argue with each other and have different fundamental ideas, or like, you know, like Buddhism and Hinduism, like Buddhism like strips away one of the fundamental hypotheses of what reality is supposed to be, right? Like Anatta, no soul, no, like that's a huge core proclamation of Buddhism. But
Well, and there are semantic nuances to this. Speaking of semantic nuances,
we should talk about that, because it's one of those things that I continuously am like kind of understanding, but not fully understanding.
Yeah.
But what I think
it's not quite antithetical. There's some ideas. I'd say the common thinking about anatta is that it means no self. And Michael James, who's a really great scholar of Indian philosophy, says it's actually not quite antithetical to Atman. He says the term actually in English is closer to non-self than no self, which is subtle.
Yeah. So we should spell this out
but
for
anyway,
people. And I'll get to my other. I sort of blue balled my punch.
Sorry, I interrupted your.
No, it's okay. That's how that's how the mind melds go, baby. it's a conversation. But yeah, so a lot of people might be familiar with this idea of the Atman, right? Is that you kind of have, from the Hindu Indian traditional perspective, you have a shard of Brahma in you. You have a shard of the non-dual essence, godliness in you, and they call that the Atman. And Buddha comes along and actually says the opposite of that, like at least linguistically, on Atman. So it depends on if we're talking Pali or Sanskrit, for anatta versus on Atman, but it means the same thing. Like literally, no Atman is what they're saying. So he seemingly does away with this idea of the immortal soul. Yet you have all of these things in Buddhism that from a Western perspective seem like they require a soul. So it's like trying to wrap your mind around that. Like I took a Buddhist philosophy class as an undergrad too. And I remember coming across some of these ideas. I'm like, explain this to me. Because like how they believe in transmigration, they believe in, clearly some immaterial essence that reincarnates over and over again. Like,
well, I think non-duality really is the solution that answers this. And I'm happy to go into more detail with you on this, because the Buddha was doing a very similar thing actually to Jesus. This gets some love in my book, which is that the avatars, these great enlightened beings, men and women throughout history, that break the veil on separateness, they see unconditional love, they see unconditional oneness everywhere they look, Christ consciousness, to use that term. The Hindus call them avatars. Specifically, they consider them to be incarnations of Vishnu, which is, I don't, that's fine to me. I'm kind of like you on that. It's like, that's great. If they are wonderful, I just see them as, I'll look at their teaching and there's a lot of parallels. There's many, many parallels. I specifically focus on Krishna, Buddha, and Christ. But what happens in Buddha and Jesus's own historical life as men walking around, they tend to correct the decaying institution of their day. Jesus was a Jew, and he's calling out some hypocrisy of the Pharisees, who are one of the religious sects with some authority in ancient Judea, which I love to dissect. Buddha is doing the same thing. Buddha is calling out essentially wooden, emptied out Hindu teachers, by way of their own felt experience. Um, their level of attainment is just naturally corrective. I don't think they're necessarily going out trying to prove it. But what happens to both of them is people come up to them and kind of ask them questions. And some people challenge them. They're like, I've heard you're the wise guy,
Yeah.
And so the Anatta philosophy comes. There's a great book called The Gospel of Buddha, by Paul Karras. I think it's 1894, and he took the Dhammapada, the Pali Canon. He took different sources and made it, an easier American read in the style of the Gospels of the New Testament. So there's this fun kind of narrative of his life, and that's basically what it was. A Hindu teacher, a guru, was, there was a lot of obsession with the ritual and the ritualistic dogma. For example, the fire rituals in the Vedas. There's a lot of emphasis on fire, and Buddha says something like, he says, the fire is in the mind. The fire is anger. The fire is lust. He just supersedes the whole game. He transcends the whole game. And so back to the Anatta Atman dialogue here, he essentially is calling out the overemphasis on karmic recipe. Basically, in Hinduism, there's almost this paranoia that comes from this hyper focus on your past karma, your future karma, doing the right thing, doing the ritual in the order of the thing to get the greatest reward karmically. And he just said, this is all, there's non-self, guys. He was really kind of blowing their minds to say, you're way too focused on
your soul,
the video game points.
Soul. Yeah. This is making sense because I think, and this actually beautifully, it's perfect that we went this way now, because my original point that I was going to say before that, when I started to say what I think runs underneath all of it is nous, and nous means mind, and oftentimes it's translated as divine mind. So if you, and I may be taking this I may be taking this the wrong way, but when you think about the idea of you personally have an Atman or soul, maybe his point was that you don't have a soul, but there is mind at large, and you need to come to a realization of, in their words, I guess, nirvana or some kind of non-dual state of mind, so that you can actually understand your true state as not separate. And if you can come, and that to me is indistinguishable from what's going on in Western esotericism and Platonism, this idea of, especially in the like Platonian, Plotinus sort of tradition of having your consciousness climb toward the one and the non-dual and the origin of everything.
Absolutely.
Well put. Maybe that stitches the ideas.
Yeah, Krishnamurti's image is great. The islands, it's just lower the ocean.
Oh, yeah.
We all think we're separate islands, but when the ocean is lowered, the reality of the one continent, there's all these great nature metaphors for this process, right? But yeah, I think you're right, and I think that there is. I mean, non-duality elaborates, and of course in Miracles, actually, this is funny, in Manual for Teachers, which is the last 100 pages of 3,000 or something crazy.
So I would just skip right to that, right?
Ouija board it wherever your message is. But it says
that is what my ego does when I pick up like a new book, is like, if it's on a spiritual thing, I'm like, let me get to the point. Let me get to the point at the end. And then I always go back and.
That's funny. Yeah, it says, what's the deal with reincarnation, basically. And It says the only question that you should ask about reincarnation is it useful? Which I really like that, because I think that essentially what it says is there's a lot of folks that think that they're Benjamin Franklin or Cleopatra,
Right.
and that's what that does is it takes you out of this moment. I do think in my book I referenced Dr. Ian Stevenson. I'm sure you're familiar with University of Virginia. There's a lot of really good academic research on reincarnation. I know that sounds crazy to the
No,
mainstream, but
I want to talk
you
to this
know
guy.
this.
Yeah, tell people about it again, because it's
Jim,
pretty mind blowing. Yeah.
Jim Tucker is his successor. Dr. Ian Stevenson has since left his incarnation for his next one. Haha. He worked for decades, and he would study children
At a
who
university, right?
at University of
Yeah.
Virginia.
Yeah.
I mean, extremely valid stuff. And Jim Tucker and his team have iterated and have created even more diligent and rigorous criteria for genuine experiences, because there's a lot of obviously opportunists out there, I think, especially in social media land nowadays. But anyway, my book touches on it and then kind of points folks into greater direction. But Dr. Stevenson really is the father of academic study of reincarnation. Anyway, he talks about all these different stories. He studied 10,000 cases, thousands at least, and a birthmark that corresponds to a wound in a past life, and that's also in line with kind of how Yogananda and these gurus describe how it works in terms of the transmigration. We're just carrying stuff. We're just carrying our stuff, and if something was particularly emotionally heavy, like, that's going to have some impact. Xenoglossy is another term Stevenson talks about, which is children who can speak another language that they shouldn't be able to, essentially, or explaining details about things like that. So I will say this: I do think reincarnation is true in the dream. That's the asterisk. It's just, this is all a dream. So in the transcendental capital R reality, there's no reincarnation. There's no self, that non-self, But in separation land here, which is where we are now, I'm Bob and you're Michael over there. And, the reincarnation is an aspect of this plane.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the Timaeus's account of creation at all?
I don't think so.
Dude, you would love this. And you're the
Hit me.
The biblical overlaps. I mean, it's right there. It's right there. And not only is it very similar to Genesis in a lot of ways, it actually makes quite a bit more sense, I think. And it fundamentally kind of changes the ontological imperative and metaphysical imperative for like what you're doing as an individual in a way that like really speaks to me personally. But I'm just bringing it up because there is the idea of transmigration or reincarnation goes very, very far back in the Western tradition, at least to Pythagoras, probably before that. Quite possible Pythagoras had some overlap with, Vedic kinds of ideas. We don't know, but anyway.
They definitely, Alexander the Great had a Hindu teacher. So yeah, there was close proximity between ancient Greece and ancient India.
Yeah, and there's and this is like, this is way Alexander was way after
way
him.
Before him.
He was a contemporary of Aristotle, and Aristotle was one of his teachers too. Dude, there's a real quick sidebar, just because to show you the level of hidden teachings that are in all of Plato and even Aristotle's teachings, where Aristotle is usually not thought of as an esotericist. Usually he's thought of as like he's very empirical, like scientific
biologist.
Yeah. So he was teaching philosophy to Alexander, and he was teaching him Plato, and he was teaching him all this stuff. And he said, so far I'm only learning the stuff that you've published. Like, when do I get to the esoteric teachings? And he says, these are the esoteric teachings, basically. And he's like, well, what do you mean? And he says, I have both published them and not published them.
That's dope.
So he's very much being like, you'll see the esoteric teachings when you're ready to see them is sort of his
That's
answer.
beautiful.
Uh,
Yeah, I've
but
come not
yes,
to bring peace.
right, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that is a good example of that. I do like that example for sure. Uh, but anyway, like without going off on a huge Platonic tangent here, there's a specific reason that souls are in this almost samsaric type of situation, um, going back to Platonism and before. And the Timaeus sort of begins to outline it when it's talking about how souls, basically how souls were created and the sort of alchemical recipe for making a human being, and what soul is and where all of these tools that the demiurge uses to create reality are being taken from and all of this stuff. Um, but without getting into all of that, there's a reason for it, and it deeply changes the sort of, like I said before, the metaphysical and ontological imperative of what it is to be a human being, because it's kind of the same thing as it is in the East if you're looking at it from broad strokes. And what is it? It's to wake up to the fact that you're a cycling being going through iterative sorts of um, versions of life, but you can wake up to nous, you can wake up to mind, and you can either see through that process to an extent and align yourself with this higher mind. And the problem is like just like every school of thought, this eventually branches off, and like what you're capable of is not clear. Like, can you escape the recreation and fate cycle, or are you
Mm.
stuck in that? But it's still better to see through it than not see through it, and then you get to be sort of like a Platonic bodhisattva, which is actually a real idea talked about by people like Iamblichus. They don't use
Wow.
the word bodhisattva, but they use it's the exact same thing. It's you can wake up like and remember basically your connection to nous, and then share that with everybody else while you're alive. Um, and then you'll get sort of preferential treatment, kind of like a bodhisattva, where you're more aware through that process, and you'll remember your teacher in your next incarnation too, and you can keep going through that iterative process. But either way, it changes the whole game from like what we're used to, right? Which is like, oh, I need to be, and you were even alluding to this with the disruption that Buddha did with the standardized way that Hinduism was being looked at, and that people became self-obsessed, right? Just like they are now. Like
Yeah.
their religion is about saving them. It's about, oh, I don't want to sin. I don't want to do this because of me, which meanwhile is sucking you deeper into that way of thinking, into disconnection from God, the whatever you non-dual truth, whatever the light, whatever you want to call it.
Well put. Yeah, it's true. I mean, it really just the schisms,
Yeah.
the misinterpretation. It takes one fumble to get from the source to the error. There's a great image that I've been quoting a lot. The volcano, brother David Steindl-Rast, who's a Benedictine monk, I believe. When I heard this quote, I was so annoyed because I was like, I wish that was in my book, because that's my whole thesis of life. And damn it, it's so good. He says all religions start from mysticism.
Yeah.
You can't start a religion without mysticism. It's like a volcano that when it explodes is this lava of vitality and force and just undeniable. And then the lava just starts to move down the side of the mountain, and it starts to cool off.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
after a
Yeah.
decade or a century or 2 millennia, it just becomes cold, dead rock. So that's institutional religion. It starts from this connection that's so powerful, and then just becomes empty and wooden. And I think the lesson in that to me is that means it's up to everyone all the
Yes.
time in every moment to continue our connection, and to engender our connection and engender others, and not to just be beholden to some ancient thing. We can venerate it, for its validity. And, I think in my view, and what I'm trying to do with my work is find the gems, amidst the rubble,
Yeah.
basically. But at the same time, it's a continual unfolding. That's why I'm
Mm.
open to like the idea of new scripture, which is blaspheme. I mean, it's like it's always unfolding. There's always the potentiality of connection.
Yeah,
So I think that's
I'm with
that's
you,
part of
man.
the mystic pantheon. Yeah.
First of all, I
Pragmatic.
to- I totally agree that like the idea of a religion without a mystical experience, I don't know, that's not a religion to me. Like because a religion, I mean,
A
while we're
religion
in
is the bottling up of it,
right, like
in a
when we're
sense.
in
Yeah.
like while we're in semantic masturbation territory, I guess let's talk about like to me to have a religion is to look at ways philosophically, practically you can understand and experience the great mystery directly. And then it becomes a religion when you start doing that with a group of other people, right? And how can you do that if there's no way to directly influence with that thing? Or at least you truly believe you're hearing from someone who had that direct experience and they have something worthwhile to share with you. Because otherwise, it's like by today's standards, it's like psychology or self help or something. Why call it a religion? So it almost
Hmm.
seems like of course a mystical experience. Of course, mysticism is at the core. But what is mysticism, Bob? That's what I want to hear.
Yeah.
And that's a word, by the way, a lot of academics don't like.
It's so true,
But
and it's a word that does require clarification, because I think a lot of people think magic,
mhm.
and maybe magic with the K, and that magic with the K is fine. No judgment there, magical friends. But typically, mystic me it actually comes from the Greek word mu, meaning silent or mute. Meaning ineffable. The contemplation of the one from a place beyond form, beyond
Mm,
concept. And there's a mystical version of every religion. We've been talking about exoteric and esoteric. Exoteric just means institution, community, and typically a mediator, to your
yeah,
point.
right.
Whereas the esoterics, there's no mediator between you and the divine. Rumi says, I looked for the divine in churches, temples, and mosques, and I found it in my heart. you know that's
Mm,
the mystical
yeah.
experience. I'll even let me just quote this one, which is Evelyn Underhill. Are you familiar with her at all?
No.
She was a early 20th century writer who very much helped to validate mystics and the mystical experience. Her book is called Mysticism. She wrote a few more, but that was kind of
Mm,
her main one. 1911. William James contemporary. The Rudolf Steiner, that
ooh,
kind of
yeah.
period of like religious
Heavy hitters.
commentators. Yeah, exactly. She's in that world. She said, this is terrific. She says, where the philosopher guesses and argues, the mystic lives and looks and speaks, consequently, the disconcerting language of first hand experience, not the neat dialectic of the schools. While the absolute of the metaphysicians remains a diagram, impersonal, and unattainable, the absolute of the mystics is lovable, attainable, alive.
Yeah, I love that.
Isn't that great?
Love
She's a
it.
little verbose
Sure,
in
yeah.
terms of the whole book is like that, but she's deep bow to her contributions.
Definitely. And doing our boy Plato dirty again because I think again another word that's been completely transformed over
Metaphysician.
time. Well, philosophy. I
Oh,
mean,
sure.
there's some I forgot what the
The
Greek word.
empty.
I forgot
This
what
is
the
being
Greek.
described as an emptier. Yeah.
Yeah, but I forgot what the Greek word is. But again, like there's either a direct line from Plato or Plato quoting Socrates where he says basically philosophy is the mystery. It is an
Mm-hmm.
experience of the mystery. Like whatever's going on in those inner teachings, providing the non-dual experience, or whatever was going on at the mystery temple of Eleusis, or whatever, that apophatic moment. That's what philosophy is. And then it's for Plato, it was always about reverse engineering that into a system that comes down to us and is and another thing I love about him is it's always backwards compatible. It's like everything in the world fits into it. It doesn't
Hmm.
and this is another esoteric thing, I feel like, where a lot of times the exoteric teaching is accept this, don't question it, have faith in it. If
Rule
it's
based.
something, if something, if you're confronted with something that flies in the face of it, that's the devil, that's a lie, that's a something.
Yeah.
But for the philosopher, not only is this mystical experience the truth, it's so true and so logically rigorous that it encompasses all of reality, and reality fits within it, and you can get there through rational rigor, through really investigating and seeing the connections and seeing how it fits in with everything else.
Yeah. The truth doesn't need to be
Yeah,
defended.
right. Yeah,
Yeah. That's
unless
beautiful.
someone's an idiot, and then you do have
And
to. No,
you roll
but
your sleeves up.
yeah, yeah. But that actually does get to another point, because it, you know, I'm with everything you're saying. I believe, I deeply believe in the value of the non-dual experience, and I do think that's what's at the root of all of this stuff. But there never seems to be agreement. Like, groups do always fraction. Even among mystics, there's squabbling. Like, one of the famous
Right.
examples actually is two contemporary-ish Platonists. They lived almost at the same time. I think they might have overlapped by some, but Plotinus and Iamblichus. Plotinus was way more.
Contemporary-ish.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You're funny.
He was way more yogic sounding, way more contemplative, way more get all this cultural stuff off. You don't need these big, crazy, ornate rituals and all of this stuff. You can go straight there through the light of your own logos, nous, etc. And then Iamblichus is like, no, 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 you don't. I don't know what you're doing, but you don't actually understand how this system works. It is a complex system. You tap into the system through these rituals. That this is how the daimones and the gods come to you, and this is how like that. So there are these disagreements, and that's something, I guess, if I were a skeptic, I would
Well, the
probably.
personalities disagree. Yeah, I'll
Yeah,
say too that I think the truth, the capital T, isn't in form. It's not
yeah,
in the concepts.
hmm,
I think a lot of the East also, there's a great image in Buddhism, the other shore, taking the boat.
hmm,
When you get the boat to the other shore, you leave the boat and then you can just walk. You don't need to keep carrying it. The form, the concept, the words about it are just, they're finger painting to recreate the Mona Lisa. We can't quite do that. I've really loved your like defense of the semantic misinterpretation, because it's a great example of like just how meager, how fragile these concepts are in terms of being able to like solidify what we're trying to get at. And so I think that's what the squabbling comes from. I mean, of course, Miracle says words are twice removed from reality,
hmm,
because they're
hmm,
symbols of
hmm,
symbols. So, it ain't in words, and it's not as fun as these frameworks are, and as like captivating and stimulating as this horizon of like mysticism and history is to me. I still at the end of the day have to acknowledge that it ain't actually in this. There's a great parable too, which I quote in my epilogue, kind of in retrospect of a book on spiritual philosophy. I basically say that, hey, it's actually not in concepts. I did my best. We're doing our best on your pod. But there's a parable from the Buddha. There's this guy who comes up to him and says, it's called the parable of the poisoned arrow. He
oh
comes
yeah, I
up to
love
him.
that. Hmm.
Isn't it great? He says, because you're the awakened one, how many realms are there? How many, dimensions are there? How many worlds are there, etc.? And he says, well, it's like this. Two armies are fighting in a war. A man is shot by a poisoned arrow, and they call the medic, the doctor. And when the doctor comes, he's not concerned with who the armies are, who the generals are, where they're fighting, what they're fighting over. He's just concerned with removing the arrow and giving him the antidote. Says that's similarly, don't be don't be caught up essentially
Yeah,
in all of this world of conceptual analyses and as intriguing as they are, and I think useful as they can be. I think they can help prime the experience, or else I wouldn't sit here and spend all this time in
For
this
sure.
world with it. But ultimately, it's just about removing the arrow and removing your suffering and removing the suffering of others.
Yeah, for sure. I love that. And there's a another layer to that too, that I absolutely think that that is the point of that parable. But there's another interesting add-on to that, which is if you come from the perspective of the person asking him that question, this kind of feeds back into the who's ready for what teaching
Yeah,
conversation from earlier. Because if you're preoccupied with questions like that, where is your arrow pointed? Like, what truth are you interested in?
mm.
You're Perhaps there are all these other realms. Perhaps I'm totally open to the idea,
Right.
as I learn more, I'm not becoming less open to the idea of there being like
It's
an all
seeming more and more
pervasive
likely.
spirit realm. I'm getting more and more like, yeah, I think the ancients were onto something.
Yeah.
But, and this is Plotinus's point, is if you're going off into all of these other, questions and trying to like have contact with this being and contact with that being and get this for yourself, where's your arrow pointed? Your arrow is
Mm.
not pointed at this like non-dual ultimate truth that ultimately liberates you and like or wakes up Noose or does whatever. You're interested in all these little like side games. You're doing side quests, and I'm interested in getting to like the finding out the final
The
truth, right?
completion. Yeah.
And not to judge anybody for I want to know those things, man. Like if you were like, Michael, I can right now, I can get you in touch with your guardian spirit. Let's go. Like I would absolutely do it. I would absolutely do it. But at the same time, if that's not part of the ultimate thing that we're talking about here, it is ultimately a distraction, right? It's a new way to entertain yourself. It's a new way to do something for your ego. It's a new way to elevate yourself. And that is kind of beside the ultimate point.
Yeah, lasting peace.
Yeah.
I think that's really the key, in that the world of sensory phenomena doesn't have it. It has it for some time. You know,
Mm-hmm.
a moment, a day, a year, a few years. But ultimately, it's a Sisyphean
Yeah.
search that, it's kind of like, okay, when are you going to be done being frustrated by never being satisfied?
Yeah.
And I think coming back to Buddha, we teased about that, the first noble truth and kind of his semantic play. He says the common English interpretation is life is suffering as the first noble
Mm-hmm.
truth. And it's really not that. That's the English misread. To me, it's actually, or to scholars, I should say, the consensus is life is unsatisfactoriness, or
Yeah.
this world is unsatisfactoriness, which is right there in line with all these mystic traditions. You're not going to find lasting peace outside of you in any kind
Right.
of external proximity to you. So, but also at the same time, there's no judgment if you do. I like that you said that a course, and the beauty of a course is forgiveness and non-judgment, and it's kind of like when you do judge yourself for that, or you judge others for that, you're actually imprisoning yourself. You either put handcuffs on or you have the key. Do
Right.
you want to judge people, or do you want to forgive them and forgive yourself? So I
Totally.
think that's all part of it, but it's ultimately, yeah, are you trying to find lasting peace, or some momentary peace that ends in frustration and pain?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Like in your heart of hearts, locate that desire, because I
Yeah.
think kindling that desire probably over the course of many lifetimes, unfortunately, I think that if you put a gun to my head and said, what do you really think we're here to like, or not here to do? I don't think that's the right way to put it.
Mm.
But if you really want to get to the truth, or you really want to quote unquote get beyond, graduate, whatever it is, whatever the right word is, that's what it is. I think it's kindling that noetic desire, that so that it consumes this lower version of you over the course of many lifetimes. And like kind of cathartically burns away all of that stuff, that's when the soul transmutes, or when it goes back to the source, or moksha, or whatever it is, um and even
Totally.
and that gives idiots like you and me plenty of time to, like, we're not living that lifestyle, we're not ascetics, we're not like, just, you know focused on that. I mean, probably more than most by a lot, but not full time. um
My
so yeah,
mirror's got some polishing.
and plenty of polishing left to do on my end as well, that is for sure. I love you, man. It's been a fun mind meld.
Love you, brother.
uh
This is great.
Give everybody the details on your book and such.
Yeah, it's called Original Sin is a Lie. The subtitle is less spicy. It's How Spirituality Defies Dogma and Reveals Our True Self. The original subtitle was Original Sin is a Lie and Other Truths from the Spiritual Buffet Line,
I like that
which I
too.
really like that term, but the new subtitle's better. But anyway, yeah, originalsinisally.com. I'm mostly on Instagram and TikTok, and not arguing with the angry Christians in my comments, just
the
sending
the
them meta.
the exoteric sort, no doubt.
Right. Yeah, mostly most people are grateful and sweet. And, not everybody's, it's not for everybody. That's been the theme today.
Yeah, that we'll just call it this.
That's
Not for
okay.
everybody. Not for everybody.
Right.